can give us things we need as truth in our own life, things that churches need as truth, and things that represent periods in history all at the same time. That amazes me that God can do that. And so the people that first figured this out, they didn't figure out these were time periods right at the beginning because they were in the middle of the first one, right? And so it wasn't until later on that they started saying, these churches kind of look like they represent periods historically as well. And so really it was the dispensationalists, and I looked that up, and they mean a lot of things. Dispensationalists that started teaching this, and some of the dispensationalists are Scofield, who is very well respected, D.L. Moody. There are many. Whether or not this is not like foundational today. This is not, you're going to make it to heaven if you believe this, and you're not if you don't. But it is an interesting teaching that I want to give you today. So, let's look at the first church. And I want to just really quickly hit on each of the churches and what they represented, and then go from there with what they are in a time period. So the first church was Ephesus, and the main message to Ephesus was, you've lost your first love for Jesus. And this, as far it started, the age that this represents was called the Apostolic Age, which was the time period where the apostles lived. The people who had first-hand contact with Jesus. It was a primary source. We teach that, right, Kathy, in social studies. Primary sources. They witnessed it firsthand, not a secondary source. So this was the Apostolic Age, and it went from the death of Christ, which was about 33 A.D., up to 100 A.D., which was the thought date that John, the beloved, died on the Isle of Patmos. He died pretty peacefully. He's the only apostle that wasn't martyred. Okay, so with the death of the last apostle, that Apostolic Age ended. It was full of persecution, we know. And with the death of John, this age, this Ephesian age, ended. Okay? The second church was Smyrna. And remember, the main message to Smyrna, it had no condemnation, was to remain faithful in a time of persecution and poverty. And this period was from 100 A.D. up through 10 Roman Caesars that persecuted Christians. There were 10 Caesars in that period of time. Diocletian was probably the worst. That killed in the Colosseums. They had a period of 10 rulers that persecuted the Christians. And when in verse 10 of chapter 2 it says, you will suffer for 10 days, a lot of people believe that could be the 10 Roman rulers that persecuted Christians, those 10 days. This lasted up to, circa means about, 312 A.D. And this was one of the best time periods in the church. Now, isn't that ironic that a period of persecution was the period the church grew the most, when the church really thrived? Now, in 312, what happened was, if we go to the next one, we get to Pergamum. And what happened in 312 was Constantine was the Roman emperor, the Roman ruler, and he had a vision of the cross, and he believed that if he began to worship this God of the Christians, he would have victory in the battle he was facing. And so he went to battle, he had victory, and his response to that was to then say, okay, everybody's a Christian. And he had all of his troops baptized. They probably had no idea what they were doing. It wasn't a personal relationship commitment. And at that point, the church became married to the state. And remember, the church of Pergamum wasn't really a good message, right? Satan's city. All right? I know you're living in Satan's city. And the church, everybody was baptized. There was not everyone making that commitment for themselves. And so that was a dark period for the church. Jesus became one of many gods in that time period. That lasted up to the beginning of the Middle Ages, which was about 1500, was when, around when the Middle Ages started. The Middle Ages kicked off the next church period, which was Thyatira. And the message to Thyatira was to resist false teaching. Now, think about the Middle Ages. Okay, what was going on? There were lots of troops going over to the Holy Land with crusades. All right, they were fighting for Jerusalem during that time period. But this, again, was not a real good message, to resist false teaching. A lot of corruption entered into the faith, entered into the church during that time. And there were lots of cathedrals being built. And do you know how all those beautiful cathedrals were built in Europe? On the backs of the people. They were forced to pay penance for their sins. They had to pay the church to be forgiven. And the list of what they had to pay and the price became longer and longer and longer and more expensive and more expensive and more expensive during that time period, because they wanted to build all these cathedrals. And there was lots of corruption with the leadership of the church in that time period. And the church became very powerful. In fact, they were politically powerful during the Middle Ages. If you study history, the church was very much a political powerhouse during that time. The next church then was Sardis. And this began with Reformation, the changes to try and wake the church up, to try and get them back on track with Scripture. And it started with Martin Luther, who his dad saved his money and got him to go to school. He wanted him to become a lawyer. And when he got to school, he decided to become a monk. He felt the call of the Lord, and so he went into a monastery and he started reading Scripture. And as he read Scripture, he found that what he was reading was not the way the church was acting. And at that time period, this was about the time period that the printing press was being invented. 15-something, I didn't look the date up. The printing press was invented. And so Martin Luther, the people didn't know what the Scripture said. All they could go on was what the leadership of the church was telling them. And so Martin Luther started reading the Bible for himself. And he started saying, this is not the way it's supposed to be. This isn't the way that God intended this to be. And the verse that really turned him around was Romans 1:17, that says, the just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith. And he said, if the righteous shall live by faith, why are we having to pay all this money to build these cathedrals to be forgiven if the just shall live by faith? And so he started looking at what was going on in the church, and he started calling out those things that were not lining up with Scripture. And he made a list of 95 things, and he nailed them to the door of the Wittenberg Church in Germany. It was called the 95 Theses. 95 things that were not the way the Scripture that he was reading played out. And in that, he was persecuted. He was thrown out of the established church. And he later in life then translated the Bible into German. At that point, it was only in Latin and maybe probably Hebrew and Greek. But Latin was the language. And he translated it, the whole New Testament, into German. And then guess what the printing press started doing? Printing Scripture. And then the Scripture got into the hands of the people that couldn't read it before. And things started to change in the church. And so it was an awakening time. All right. Next church, Philadelphia. This was a period from around the 1750s to the 1900s. It was a time of revival, a time of the Great Awakening in the United States. It was a time where Charles Spurgeon, D.L. Moody, Jonathan Edwards, all these revivals, there was an awakening back to Christianity during that time. And then in 1900 to 1925, the dispensationalists believed that Laodicea the Laodicean church started. That time period began. Now, most of these teachings say that all 7 churches exist over the whole course of the time. All of them are here to some extent. But the primary church, the primary focus of those time periods would be those churches. Which means, if we are living in the Laodicean church era, what is the message to this generation? Lukewarm. You're lukewarm. Now, do I believe that there are Smyrna Christians today? Yes. Look at China. There are many places that have Smyrna-type messages today where there is all kinds of persecution. But the church at large is lukewarm compared to other churches. Okay, so this is a time of false teaching, where false teaching is tolerated. And it's a period where the second coming of Jesus is approaching. Now, I want to, and I have my phone in my pocket, because just as I was studying this, something came across my email, and I read it, and I want to share it with you. Because I was just typing about false teaching, and this came across my email. It may have come from Dad, I'm not sure, I don't know where it came. No, it was a mailing I got from the Methodist Church. Complaint filed again, and it had this lady's name in the mailing. It had, "The trial of Cynthia Meyer will go on." And I thought, what is that supposed to mean? So I Googled it. Who's Cynthia Meyer? I Googled it, and this complaint was filed against a Kansas pastor who came out during a sermon in January 15th. No, January 15th was the meeting. I think it was January 3rd or around in there. She got up in the pulpit on a Sunday morning and announced that she was gay. Openly, she was announcing that she was in love with another woman and had been for years. And the church responded by saying that's not what we believe, which I'm glad for that. But that false teaching, and many have come to her defense saying, no, that's fine. That's not against Scripture. You know, a lot of people have come around her. I'm thankful that the Methodist bishop in her area has said that is not what we believe in our area. But that just flashed. Is there a lot of false teaching out there right now? Is there a lot of false teaching? Yeah, and you know, Jeff is telling me about someone he works with that's just really frustrated with his church that the Bible is not being preached. And I think that is becoming more and more and more and more the norm. Do you agree with that? That more and more, this isn't the ultimate authority. It's just a book of whatever. And it's not the inspired Word of God. So what do we do with this? You know, you may have thought, I don't care about all that stuff today. But what do we do with this? Well, first of all, we're going to face trials. No matter what generation we live in. How many of you have had a trial this week? Something difficult this week? Probably most of us have had something that was difficult this week. We're destined to face trials no matter what. But rewards are offered to those who are overcomers. And here are the rewards. We'll get to eat from the tree of life. We'll be given the crown of life. We'll be given a new name. We'll be given power over the nations. Our name will be written in the book of life. And we will be a pillar in God's temple. And so, as I prayed about where the Lord wanted me, actually a week ago, I was out on my swing. And the Lord just brought something very bizarre to mind. Just made me think, you're going to think, oh my lands, where is she going with this? And last week, if you remember, I said, no, it doesn't really fit. And I'm not sure it does today, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. I started thinking about, the Lord just brought to mind the fairy tale of Jack and the Beanstalk. Is that strange or what? Jack and the Beanstalk. And so I'm thinking about the story of Jack and the Beanstalk and how that all transpired. And I knew it was the Lord talking to me, so I didn't know where He was going with this. And so as I, in my mind, retold the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, I'm going to tell you what things came to my mind. And it may not be completely accurate with, different versions. But Jack's mother, they had nothing left to eat. They were desperate. Is that how you remember it? And they had a cow. And his mother said, take this cow, Jack, and go buy seed so that we can plant and die, I guess. Buy food for us to eat. And so Jack goes to buy the food, and he comes back with magic beans, okay? And what's he do with the magic beans? He plants them. And what happens when he plants them? This beanstalk grows. And so what does Jack do? He climbs the beanstalk, and what's up there? A giant. And he is able to get from the giant the golden eggs, right? The treasure. All right? So that's the story. He comes down, and they have more than they could have imagined because of that. And they chop the beanstalk down. And so I'm like, what are you trying to tell me, Lord? And so I want to read a scripture to you. And it's on if you'll go ahead a couple slides. The pearl of great value, Matthew 13:45. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and he sold everything he had and he bought it. No matter what age we live in, Jack could have been satisfied with just going through the motions on this earth. He could have been satisfied with just making it. He could have been satisfied with just doing his everyday, doing his everything, working, trying to make it. But instead, he sold everything, the last cow, the last thing that he had. He took his all, and he sowed seed. And then he was willing to confront the enemy for the treasure that was his. He was willing to go against the enemy to get the treasure that God had designed for him. And God, we are so satisfied just going through the motions and trying to make this a good life here. Being satisfied with here. Being satisfied with just this. But we are made for more than that. We are made for the treasure that God has for us in heaven. And we're storing up treasure here, and we got nothing up there. And we're not willing to fight the enemy for what he has for us, what God has for us. We just are satisfied in the muck and the mire and the do it for this life thinking instead of heavenly mindedness, instead of going for the treasure that God has for us, instead of sowing the seeds that he has for us, instead of being willing to give it all for him, to give it all for that great pearl, to sell everything for the great pearl. And that's what God has for us. No matter what time period. The Laodicean church is a church that is so satisfied with the world. We're so comfortable. We're so comfortable where we are. And God says there's so much more. You were made to thrive, not just survive. So I don't know if that means anything to you or not, but that's what the Lord showed me about a week ago. And we can look with our eyes and things can look like such a mess. But we don't see the other side of the picture. And we have to trust him to be weaving it all for good. And when we give him our all, he does that. When we take everything we have and we sow the seed that he has, he does that. Let's pray. Father God, Lord, help us to seek that great pearl more than anything. The pearl of great value. Lord, help us to sow the seed. Help us to seek you in all that we do. Lord, help us to give our all. To not be lukewarm, to not be satisfied, Lord. To believe you for all that you tell us that you will do in our lives. And I'm not talking materially. I'm talking spiritually. Lord, we love you and we give you praise in Jesus' name.